After the Empire of Japan completed its defeat of the Dutch East Indies in March 1942, the Japanese Navy devised a bold follow-up strike. Gathering together the full power of its mighty force of aircraft carriers, they set out into the Indian Ocean, determined to launch a Pearl Harbor-style attack that would destroy the British Eastern Fleet once and for all. In the spring of 1942, the Royal Navy was reeling from heavy blows in the east. Malaya and Singapore had fallen, and the remaining British ships in the East Indies had been sunk at the battles of the Java Sea. The task then for Admiral James Somerville, who arrived to become the Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Fleet at the end of March, was a difficult one. At this time, a new Eastern Fleet was being hurriedly assembled at Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to provide some kind of force to protect India from potential Japanese invasion. Somerville's fleet was an impressive size on paper. He had 3 aircraft carriers, Formidable, Indomitable and Hermes, and 5 battleships, Warspite, Ramillies, Revenge, Resolution and Royal Sovereign. But this wasn't the full story. Only Warspite had been modernised and was capable of the speed and endurance needed for extended operations. The other battleships were really only suitable for convoy escort duty. The carriers too were flawed. Hermes was old and Formidable and Indomitable's air crews were inexperienced. The 2 modern carriers also had armoured decks, reducing the number of aircraft that each could carry. Somerville's total air group was only 39 fighters and 57 strike aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood the potential weakness of the British. In March 1942, they actually thought the Eastern Fleet was even smaller at 2 battleships and 2 carriers, but believed heavy reinforcements were on the way, including 2 further carriers and 6 more battleships. This meant there was an opportunity to destroy the British fleet before its reinforcements could arrive, and assure Japanese naval control over the Indian Ocean. It was an opportunity they were not about to pass up. At the start of April 1942, Japan began a 2-pronged offensive into the Indian Ocean, codenamed Operation Sea. The first phase saw Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa lead a task force including the light carrier Ryuho into the Bay of Bengal. Once there, over a 5-day period, they rampaged through Allied shipping lanes, sinking more than 20 ships and around 100,000 tons of shipping before returning to port. As if to underline the overwhelming naval strength Japan now enjoyed, Ozawa's force went completely unbothered by Allied naval or air forces as it sighed through Britain's merchantmen. This was because to the south, Admiral Somerville's fleet had more than enough problems of its own. A few days before the end of March, the main Japanese force departed the East Indies, crossing into the Indian Ocean and progressing up the coast of Sumatra. This was the core of Japan's naval strength, the fearsome Kido Butai, with 5 fleet aircraft carriers and 4 fast battleships under the command of Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. It was the same force as that which had attacked Pearl Harbor and devastated Port Darwin in Australia in the middle of February. Nagumo's fleet turned eastwards on April 3rd, intending to approach the ports of Colombo and Trincomalee and launch massive airstrikes, aiming to once again catch Allied ships in port. Thankfully for the British, the Japanese naval code had been broken, and so Admiral Somerville was forewarned about the planned Japanese offensive. British intelligence pointed to an attack on Colombo on April 1st, and Somerville's own assessment was that Japan would only have perhaps 2 carriers available for this operation. He therefore devised a plan to take his fleet to sea, evade the Japanese initially, and then launch night torpedo attacks on the enemy, making use of radar-equipped bombers. Admiral Somerville assembled his fleet south of Ceylon on March 31st and waited. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately as we shall see, for 2 days the Japanese were nowhere to be seen. By April 3rd, the slow, unmodernised battleships in the British fleet were low on fuel, and as far as Somerville could make out, there was no imminent Japanese attack coming. He therefore set about returning to port. The bulk of the fleet would move to a new anchorage at Adu Atoll in the Maldives, with the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Devonshire travelling back to Colombo and the carrier Hermes heading for Trincomalee. Unbeknownst to Somerville, the Japanese strike force had merely been delayed leaving the East Indies and was twice the size of the force the British expected. Barely a few hours after the Eastern Fleet arrived at Adu Atoll on April 4th, a Catalina flying boat made contact with a large Japanese fleet steaming northeast towards Ceylon. Somerville immediately stepped up the refuelling, managing to get back to sea with his faster ships grouped up as Force A just after midnight. The British admiral still harboured ambitions of pressing home an attack at night, still unaware at this point of the true strength of the enemy fleet. The cruisers Cornwall and Devonshire were ordered to link up with Force A, leaving Colombo at 10 PM on April 4th. Early the next morning, the Japanese carriers swung into action. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo led 91 Japanese bombers on the attack run, escorted by 36 fighters. At 8 AM, Colombo was hit hard. Waves of Japanese bombers appeared, devastating the port facilities with impunity. The small numbers of Allied fighters on Ceylon tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The only positive for the British was that little damage was done to shipping, as most had already left port, but this was about to change. At 11:30, the Cornwall and Dorsetshire were spotted and shadowed by an enemy reconnaissance plane. The crew were fully aware of what the lone aircraft heralded, and sure enough, after 2 hours, 80 dive bombers appeared over the horizon, led by Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa. It was a rapid and devastating onslaught. Within 20 minutes, both ships had gone to the bottom, surviving barely long enough to inform Somerville of what was happening. Immediately on receipt of signals from the cruisers, Somerville realised his assessment of the Japanese strength had been wrong. It was much more powerful than he had thought. In an instant, his focus had to change from trying to attack the enemy to just trying to keep his remaining ships afloat. As the historian Evan Mawdsley puts it, Somerville had suddenly realised that he was not the hunter, but the fox. The Admiral's biggest fear now was that the Japanese would attack Adu Atoll, but mercifully for him, they had no idea of its existence. Admiral Nagumo was in fact already steaming away from Somerville, spending the next 3 days repositioning his fleet for the upcoming attack on Trincomalee. This began in the early morning of April 9th, again with a large attack force devastating the port area, but failing to catch significant vessels in port. HMS Hermes and her escorting destroyer Vampire had left the previous evening to avoid the attack. It was not a planned departure, so Hermes was not even carrying any aircraft when she was discovered at 9 AM, and a wave of 80 dive bombers, again led by Lieutenant Commander Egusa, approached. Hermes stood no chance and was hit again and again until she sank. All told, more than 40 bombs found their target. At 11:02, Vampire went the same way when her magazine exploded. Having completed their operations, Admiral Nagumo's fleet now steamed away, returning ultimately to Japan to rest and refit ahead of future campaigns. Though Admiral Somerville had lost a carrier and 2 cruisers, he had actually been quite lucky. Had the Japanese arrived at Ceylon when the entire Eastern Fleet was together at the start of April, the resulting battle would have likely been devastating, particularly for the slow old battleships. As it was, even before Hermes was sunk, Somerville had decided to pull his ships out of the Eastern Indian Ocean entirely. The slow Force B ships would head for East Africa, the fast Force A for Bombay. The Admiralty was not particularly happy about this, but as far as Somerville was concerned, it was retreat or see the Eastern Fleet destroyed. Further Japanese attacks were to be expected, and perhaps even an invasion of India from the sea. Winston Churchill would later call this the most dangerous moment of the war. He was faced with a seemingly unstoppable Japanese advance that could yet engulf India and the Western Indian Ocean, while all the while the European war remained in the balance and the Royal Navy was being stretched to breaking point across at least 4 major theatres. In fact, it was Japan's first and last major foray into the Indian Ocean. Before too long, the operational commitments against the United States in the Pacific would be all-consuming, and then the Battle of Midway would happen. With this in mind, there's a strong argument that Operation C was a strategic mistake, that Japan's carriers would have been better served strengthening their position in the South Pacific while the US was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. On the other hand, the Japanese did force a British retreat from Ceylon, but in truth, Somerville's ragtag fleet was not that much of a threat to the new Japanese holdings in Southeast Asia anyway. On the British side, the Indian Ocean Raid, as the battle would come to be known, was yet another humiliating episode. Though they had escaped without major damage, the degradation of Britain's naval power was exposed as so bad as to require the surrender of large parts of the Indian Ocean, as well as the East Indies. The frustrating thing for Somerville was that the situation could have been different if only Britain's priorities had been. Shortly after the raid, he wrote, "It looks to me as if the Japs can walk in anytime they like. We might lose India just for the sake of a handful of aircraft and 1 or 2 decent ships." The interesting point here is that what Somerville was after, particularly in terms of planes, was not a huge commitment of industrial capacity, but it ultimately wasn't available, in part because the government was fully committed to the area bombing campaign over Germany. As Mawdsley points out, a month after a dozen British planes tried to defend Ceylon, the RAF would send 1,000 heavy and medium bombers against Cologne. Broadly, the fighting of the Second World War for Britain was ultimately about prioritisation, and from the pre-war years onwards, the Far East had taken a lower priority for supplies, troops, ships and aircraft. The Indian Ocean Raid and the Royal Navy's humiliating retreat was the culmination of those decisions and of the disastrous events of the previous few months. Thanks again to Call of War for sponsoring this video. Remember to click the link in the description below to claim your exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. It's available only for 30 days, so don't miss out.